Hi all, I'd like to welcome you to this next talk in our series Medical Humanities and Pandemic Urbanisms. I'm Rishi Goyal, Director of the Medical Humanities major here at Columbia. I'd like to thank the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society and the Society of Fellows Heyman Center for supporting this event. We are lucky to be able to reschedule this event that had been detained for many reasons, not least of which is COVID, the graduate student strike, and kind of all the sort of calamities and disruptions that we've all been experiencing. But I'm glad that we've been able to kind of reschedule it for today. The idea of this talk in this series is to just highlight the many ways in which the humanities and the social sciences disciplines can add and aid our understanding of this sort of biomedical event that we're living through. COVID, like other pandemics, provides a kind of social analysis, telling us who and what we value and how and why we value it. Despite the many biotechnological developments from oral antivirals, vaccines, and monoclonal antibodies, we are seeing that there are incredible deaths, losses, and suffering that should have been mitigated, should have been prevented. And we'd like to try to understand why and how those have happened. So today we have a wonderful speaker, Professor Rohit Negi, who I'm going to introduce in a second, and a respondent, who I will also introduce beforehand, Professor Kavita Sivaramakrishnan, and I'll let them kind of go from there. But let me give you a quick bio on Professor Negi. Rohit Negi is an associate professor of urban studies at Ambedkar University Delhi. Rohit's interests are in urban and environmental change with regional specialization in India and Southern Africa. His new book, entitled Atmosphere of Collaboration, Air Pollution Science, Politics, Ecopreneurship in Delhi, is forthcoming with Routledge. Rohit is the co-editor of Space, Planning, and Everyday Citizenship in Delhi from Springer 2016. His writings have been published in several journals, including Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Geoforum, Journal of Southern African Studies, and the Economic and Political Weekly. And our respondent today is going to be our own Professor Kavita Sivaramakrishnan. She's an associate professor of sociomedical sciences in the Department of History and the Mailman School at Columbia University. She's a public health historian of South Asia with a focus on the politics of health, medicine, and science in the global South. Her most recent research is on the global politics of aging, and her new book is titled As the World Ages, Rethinking a Demographic Crisis from Harvard University Press in 2018. She is currently engaged in a new book project on the history of consumption and disease risks in South Asia. Professor Negi's talk today is entitled An Unending Catastrophe, Revanchism and Relational Urbanism in Pandemic Hit Delhi. Professor Negi, thank you very much, and please let's welcome him.
Thanks so much, Dr. Goyal. Let me just quickly share the screen. There's few images that might help us as we go along. Right. So first of all, thanks so much to the organizers, to the respondent. I know, we had planned this several months earlier. In fact, I was supposed to be on a panel last April, but then I myself got COVID and couldn't make it back then. I would also like to make clear that this is not so much an attempt at the moment to theorize what's gone on, but more a personal journey of trying to come to terms with an unresolved collective traumatic experience. It therefore may not bring very new insights to surface, especially for many of you, who are intimately aware about the goings on in India. So my aim instead is to somehow connect different, seemingly disparate elements of the contemporary from where I am that are sort of connected or joined by this thread of COVID-19. So, at the very least, I found the process of writing about these past 2 years therapeutic. So at least that much I will give it. So with its unevenness in densities, wealth, and access to basic services, the bifurcation of the urban fabric across multiple authorities and jurisdictions and a highly polluted environment make Delhi a compelling vantage point to ask critical questions on the trajectory of the novel coronavirus in a southern metropolis. Moreover, there is the sharp turn of the Indian polity towards authoritarianism and majoritarianism in the last decade, which has had deep societal impacts and urban impacts, as the emboldening of supremacist groups, deep suspicion of critical voices, and instrumental use of public institutions for divisive political ends proceeds. Tracking the coronavirus, therefore, requires simultaneous attention to the specificities, these and other specificities, alongside broader political economic processes, considering these broader processes. So today's presentation offers such a reading. So I'll move scales through the talk between the very local and the larger national and regional. The paper analyzes the diverse elements of the state's response before discussing how individuals in civil society worked to lessen the seemingly unending catastrophe. Also, another qualification is that the talk does not include the present goings on with the Omicron variant and its spread that's going on right now. So the coronavirus hit Indian shores in late January of 2020. But it was only 2 months later that the severity of the situation began to be truly recognized. After spending the previous month, that is February of 2020, in denial, it was only after the WHO categorized COVID-19 as a pandemic on 11th March that the Indian state seemed to spring into action. By mid-March, there were around 500 cases of COVID-19 in India, but tests were still difficult to source, and how the virus spread and affected bodies were questions that were still largely, the answers to which were still largely unknown. Still, the Indian government stopped international flights, and the Delhi government shut down educational institutions and other public places initially for a period of 2 weeks. On 19th March, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi appeared on television to underscore the urgency and seriousness of the virus and requested the public to observe a 14-hour curfew on the subsequent Sunday. The curfew was to be followed by people gathering on their terraces and verandas to clap or bang utensils in appreciation of the efforts of the country's frontline workers. But like many such events since then, this was made into a festival. The frontline worker event, in fact, there was yet another event where everyone was instructed by the PM a few weeks later to light a candle on their balconies, which quickly became a display of loyalty, in fact, to the party and his own cult. Soon after the initial appearance, a complete nationwide lockdown was announced. And so the lockdown entered our public lexicon and has stayed there ever since, as policy, as rumor, as trauma, and as fear all together. Following the PM's TV appearance and true to form, blind followers, or whom in local parlance we call bhakts, read far more into his words than, to be fair, even PM Modi had probably intended. These largely pseudoscientific explanations promoted the cult of the PM via WhatsApp, which is the usual medium for such propaganda across India. A prominent musician asserted that the coronavirus had a life cycle of 12 hours, and the PM's masterstroke was to enforce a 14-hour curfew, which would essentially starve the virus. A legendary actor argued that the vibrations generated by banging pots and pans were potent enough to kill the virus, which of course once more illustrated the PM's brilliance. Undoubtedly, these vignettes are amusing, but they're also equally pernicious, given the wider use of social media in the last decade or so to spread rumors and conspiracies in directions broadly consistent with the majoritarian politics of the ruling party. These, in other words, were enactments of an ongoing phenomenon. As Christos Linteris notes in post-SARS epidemiology, the idea of the super spreader came to describe individuals, and I quote, more infective than other people who spread pathogens to an extraordinary percentage of their direct or indirect contacts, end of quote. But in a uniquely Indian twist, with the efforts of the media, this concept has been fully communalized and racialized. Anchors, TV news anchors insinuated something they termed Corona Jihad, or holy war instigated from across the border to spread COVID in India. thereby adding further fuel to the ongoing othering of the Muslim minority community. Abuses were also heard in cities like Delhi and Bangalore at residents from the northeastern states of India. As Mabel Gergen and Sarah Smith write, young people from these and other border regions are seen as belonging to India's so-called Mongolian fringe, and this region's, and I quote, physical and perceived racial proximity to neighboring China and Southeast Asia is a persistent source of geopolitical anxiety. End of quote. The virus for the abusers had emerged in China, and these people to them looked Chinese. On a different register, speaking of the economy and livelihoods, the virus could not have hit India at a worse time. The Indian economy had been in consistent decline since late 2016, after the government announced the sudden demonetization of high-value currency notes at a notice of 4 hours. In hindsight, it was one of the first of several hasty and poorly planned but publicity-generating policy decisions which the government rolls out with fanfare without seeing them through. Overnight, the cash economy, which drives the substantial informal, especially the urban informal sector in India, was crippled. In addition, the decision to enact a centralized taxation infrastructure called the Goods and Services Tax in 2017, with inadequate support in place, further burdened small and medium businesses. These two sectors were still struggling to bounce back when the lockdown was announced. The next several weeks exposed the fundamental precarity that typifies the lives of the urban majority, particularly of migrant workers in Indian metros like Delhi. With no immediate end to the suffering in sight, inadequate public welfare measures, and fast running out of already meager savings, migrant workers saw few options but to travel back to their rural homes. Trains and interstate bus services were, however, still shut down. Tens of thousands of people therefore decided to cycle or walk several hundred kilometers in many cases out of sheer desperation and hopelessness. These images soon became iconic of the Indian COVID experiences in 2020. As Mukta Naik notes, they brought into relief an otherwise invisibilized population group so critical to the everyday functioning of the Indian city, but without adequate means or rights to the city. Speaking of Delhi, the territory at the best of times is an administrative quagmire. The local elected government has restricted powers because Delhi is also the headquarters of the central government. The latter is responsible for land, urban planning, and law and order. At the same time, its representative in Delhi, the lieutenant governor, acts as a competing center of authority to the elected state government. Then there is the municipality, which is responsible for several urban functions and operates as a parallel power center still. Depending on which political party controls what level of the state, the relationship between the three can become highly strained. And such frictions came to the surface at several times during the past year and a half around issues like testing for COVID-19, institutional quarantine, or home recovery, opening or unlocking of the city, and the provisioning of social welfare to beneficiaries. As the hurriedly imposed lockdown of March 2020 wound down, this is now I'm talking about summer of 2020, a few things became clear in Delhi. First, that COVID-19 was not going to go away in the immediate future. Second, that policies to tackle it would thus need to involve two simultaneous components: the ability to account for emergent issues and to adapt to more prolonged entanglements with the virus. And third, that existing systems of welfare would have to be radically scaled up to deal with the loss of livelihoods and erosion of savings. But as Delhi emerged from a strict lockdown and the virus spread through the city, and you can see here on this graph that I've compiled out of daily reports, during the first wave in Delhi, which is the summer, end of summer, the deaths rose more sharply than cases, but later both were plateauing as we went into the winter of the year. So there was a so as cases plateaued and things seemed to get better, we thought that the worst was past for the city. And there was consensus that measures other than harsh lockdowns must be tried out, given the extraordinary suffering they had brought to the urban majority. So these realizations led to the fashioning back then of what was called the Delhi model of COVID-19 management or response more broadly, based on the underlying idea of learning to live with the virus, as it was phrased. This design involved the following elements. First, to allow the urban economy to function as normally as possible. And in Delhi, given its past practices, the incumbent Aam Aadmi Party, or AAP, or Common Man's Party, as a translation, the government sought the opinion of residents, which elicited an overwhelming response against lockdowns. Second, to expand testing and conduct regular sero surveys to get a better sense of infections, even though it might be politically expedient to hide or fudge infection data, as it has been seen in many Indian states. Third, the idea was to isolate clusters, infection clusters, at the micro level, that is building and neighborhood, rather than district or the city itself. And fourth was that rather than crowding healthcare facilities, patients should be allowed to recover at home. And this system of home recovery involved regular phone calls initially from a central facility to patients for consultation and to track the progression of cases, supplying pulse oximeters to patients at home so they could monitor blood oxygen levels and know precisely when hospitalization was necessary. This would go along with quickly setting up massive dedicated COVID care facilities on the lines of what was seen earlier in Wuhan. In this manner, the Delhi model came into being, even though it met pushback from the central government at almost every juncture. And like I said, it seemed by the winter that the worst was past. But in April last year, and this is something that we all have, have very strong memories still of, a deadly COVID-19 tsunami hit Delhi. And interestingly, in Delhi, the numbering of the waves is slightly different from India in general. So the Delta, the last April wave, was actually the fourth wave for the city. Fueled by highly infectious mutant strains, including the Delta variant, infection surged as Delhi witnessed over 10,000 cases a day in that period of month, reporting over 300 deaths a day for almost a month. Testing infrastructures were stretched beyond capacity by the surge, with waiting periods of over 10 days at private laboratories and long queues at government centers. In this scenario, it became common for people with symptoms like fever, sore throat, and body aches to stay at home and begin treatment with the assumption of having contracted COVID-19. All of this meant that the actual number of cases was far higher than those officially confirmed. Anecdotally, not only, as I said, did I get the virus, but almost every colleague and neighbors did too. Many of our colleagues also spent several days and weeks in the hospital. The viciousness of the new strain made emergency hospital care necessary for many patients. Even as the state government worked overtime to expand care, the steep rise in cases quickly overran the existing capacity of hospitals and the public availability of medical oxygen, which many had begun to administer at home after failing to secure a hospital bed. So heartrending images of patients struggling to breathe in ambulances outside hospitals, family members scrambling for oxygen, and ultimately of mass cremations and burials remain etched in public memory months later. By early June, cases are back to a few hundred a day, but thousands were left grieving over loved ones across the city. These events left people fearful of the havoc future waves of infection might wreak. Thankfully, the Omicron strain has been less severe so far, but last year's experiences strongly undermined Delhi's living with the virus idea. In this scenario, the government too has been far more reluctant to let the city get back to, opening up the city right now as an acknowledgement of the fundamental uncertainty in some ways that characterizes social relations with the virus. Moreover, the larger shifts in the Indian political landscape have worsened the situation. And that's what I move to now. So in some ways, the story of the pandemic in Delhi is bookended by two massive upheavals, calling up the ongoing majoritarian corporatist agenda of the current regime and by the revanchist response of the government. So from mid-December 2019 through the first 2 months of 2020, thousands protested the enactment of the Citizenship Amendment Act by the government. The CAA strikes at the heart of the constitutional guaranteed state secularism by differentiating between refugees and their rights in India based on religion. Therefore, it is no surprise that the protests emerged most prominently in the sights of the relatively larger Muslim population who read the CAA as an attack on their citizenship itself. In Delhi, several mundane sites emerged as epicenters of anti-CAA protests. At one site, a major thoroughfare, and that's the image on the left here, a major thoroughfare was blocked and converted into a vibrant protest site, music, speeches, and art taking place through the day and night. An important metro rail station became the protest site at another place, and a public open space, a park, in a third location. These protests went on despite violence in Delhi neighborhoods instigated by ruling party apparatchiks in February of 2021. But as 2020, sorry, just confusing. But as COVID-19 restrictions rolled in, the police cited public health regulations to wind down the protests across the city. Fast forward to 2020, when the parliament passed another set of hastily drafted and insufficiently debated laws that aim to reconfigure existing structures that govern the sale of agricultural produce. The laws essentially undermine the present decentralized system of sale, wherein the state guarantees prices through what is known as the minimum support price. Critics argued that they intend to facilitate the entry of corporates into the agricultural sector, which would open the farmers to exploitation, since state guarantees would give way to private contracts. After over 2 months of protests across the region, low-intensity protests across the region, many farmer organizations with large membership decided to bring the protest to the country's capital, to Delhi. However, the central government was anxious to prevent protests from reaching the heart of the city, since optics is something taken very seriously by the government. And so they ordered the police to halt the protesters at the city's borders. 3 locations on Delhi's borders thus transformed into semi-permanent protest settlements. And the one on the right is one such location. And it remained, these sort of protest spaces remained so despite steady campaigns to demonize and delegitimize and attempts to shut them down on public health grounds. But it was only in November of 2021 when the government announced finally the withdrawal of the laws that the farmers returned to their homes. But so public health laws, just to give you a sense, have been these things have been in the news. Regulations. Similarly, news channels have been delegitimizing the farmer protests on account of the, again, their endangering of health. Meanwhile, at the same time, this major event, religious event, not only went ahead, but was actually promoted by the government in Haridwar, in the city of Haridwar. So Delhi's experiences with COVID-19 must be read alongside these political shifts. The strict lockdown dispersed the growing anti-CA protests and allowed the police to imprison critics under flimsy grounds without protests that would ordinarily accompany such arbitrary actions. The pandemic enforced closure of educational institutions further weakened yet another location from where powerful opposition to the agenda has arisen in the past. With classes moving online and hostels shut down, students were left with few options but to return home around the country, thus stalling their activism. COVID-19 and state responses then have been a test of resilience for Delhi's culture of dissent. Values, these 2 protest movements stand opposed to a state that has swerved sharply towards oligarchy and paranoia in the recent past. They've also attempted to reconstitute the public sphere, which has been lately splintered with the conjoined onslaught of neoliberalization and majoritarianism. Otherwise, too, the helplessness faced by so many who had earlier banked on their economic and or social capital to access healthcare infrastructure, the pandemic failure to strengthen public services during the past 3 decades for all. It was here that individuals and collectives stepped in. Remembering those 2 months of the pandemic, point us in the direction of the relations, social and ecological, that sustain urban living, but which are easily left out of the scramble characteristic of neoliberal urbanism. Social relational bonds with the familial or neighborly are critical to surviving crisis, whether a heat wave, as Eric Kleinenberg showed, so partly the case of Chicago, or the pandemic now. Urban densities allow for the possibility of strangers coming to help of those in need, as we witnessed during the deadly COVID, the Delta wave in Delhi. It is essential to document and learn from these experiences. So people desperately need of oxygen bed, hospital beds, oxygen, drugs, and other basic supplies, turn to their extended social networks for help. Almost every resident here in Delhi received SOS calls and messages for one or the other life-saving artifact during this time, where the immediate network could not help. Patients and caregivers, those who had access to social media, turned to it. This is a Reuters image of these, the kind of images that we all saw back then. WhatsApp groups of school friends and residents of different neighborhoods earlier used to share memes and assorted announcements, buzzed with urgent medical requirements. Many used Twitter, which is where this is drawn, where several celebrities also devoted their handles to amplify these messages. But even during these desperate times, someone in the government found it necessary or found the time to identify social media content that, according to them, painted the state's response in bad light and pressured Twitter to shut down these critical handles. Regardless, social media platforms quickly became what one observer called the unofficial disaster management agency of India. When many provincial states look to suppress information on the rapidly spiraling situation, images of mortuaries, hospital compounds, and cremation grounds taken by citizens at large expose the reality via social media. Alongside the scores of individuals who helped, Delhi civil society also played its part in managing somehow the pandemic and tiding over many related crises that have emerged in its wake. These collectives are of many kinds. There are, for instance, the Gurdwara or Sikh places of worship, communities around the Gurdwaras, which emerged as crucial nodes of assistance, whether it was providing free food to those in need, or converting entire structures into COVID care facilities. A collective called Himkund lent oxygen cylinders and concentrators. Many older civil society organizations have also continued to support vulnerable groups like those undergoing homelessness, working class migrants, and street vendors through these times. According to a review of CSOs, civil society organizations, they focus on raising funds, on generating databases of needy families, and providing relief to them in coordination with public agencies where appropriate. The review notes that CSOs have been documenting and communicating these ground realities, and they quickly moved, despite no matter what their line of work was, they moved into this space utilizing these networks that are older and more established. A study based in Delhi's satellite of Gurgaon showed how several local groups with little or no experience of disaster relief quickly organized themselves during the lockdown and collaborated to distribute food as well as assist migrants to travel back home safely. It is hoped that state appreciates the renewed assertion of the civil in society, because a specific branding of civil society organizations as quote unquote foreign agents who are anti-development has been mobilized in the last 2 decades to threaten their funding and their license to operate. But as the reality exposed the inadequacies of various scales of the state, the central government only emerged after the dust was settling on the Delta wave. And then they mounted this response, basically, as is their propaganda campaign, which now they believe they could do by foregrounding the number of vaccinations that were being carried out. And so in case some of you didn't know, in India, when we receive our vaccination certificate, that's on the left. That's the first one that I got. and we get the image of our Prime Minister attached to that certificate. On the right is a campaign, which basically it's in Hindi, but it says how the government at some point completed 100 crore. It will take me a long time to calculate that in billions, but a large number of vaccinations. To cut the story short, basically, and in conclusion, Delhi's experience with the pandemic resembles a series of catastrophes, each worse, seemingly worse than the previous ones, with no end in sight. The physical and emotional toll of COVID-19 on its residents has been immense, and it will continue for a while to come still. But there are also numerous learnings from the past year and a half, which are crucial to consider as the city prefigures its post-pandemic future. The first is that the unpredictability of the virus, as seen in different strains and the different turn it takes, threaten to overturn any kind of considered, planned government response. Even the otherwise somewhat thoughtfully assembled Delhi model was torpedoed by the spread of pernicious mutations. This shows that unpredictability has to be the bedrock on which urban policy has to be founded, and also that robust but supple social welfare mechanisms are equally critical to public health alongside medical interventions, as we have realized very clearly. Another clear realization, and I've spent a lot of time on this aspect, is that health is political. Not only are direct interventions in medical care linked with the political economic commitments of the state, but also that the regulatory aspects of public health seek to shape society in particular image. The pandemic has exposed the mistaken encouragement, not only exposed the mistaken encouragement of private healthcare over the last 3 decades at the cost of public investment, it is also about disciplining of society. So which activities are allowed and which are not? When and where are congregations legal or illegal? How has the current regime retooled in response to the kinds of things that happened after or during COVID? How do COVID-19 responses relate with the ongoing hollowing out of institutions, including the purposeful takeover of public universities, one of which I am in? It therefore stands to reason that state intervention in the name of health must be scrutinized through a wider set of variables than medical ones alone. On another register, the pandemic raises questions on the relation between humans and the biophysical world. The magnification of COVID-19 mortality and environmental conditions like air pollution and the unreliability of essential services for urban poor force residents and policymakers to pause and reflect on these relationships. It raises the point again, reminds us that we are embedded in this world alongside other entities, some of which are commensals, others are avoiders, but yet they are equally of value for vibrant, healthy urban ecology. Similarly, the ties that bind residents through material and emotional exchange, including the labor performed by migrant workers, has to be made more visible and become part of the accounting of urban populations. In part, this is about an expansive enlisting of beneficiaries for social welfare, but it is also about facilitating and promoting the social potentialities of urban life, rather than viewing citizens and their initiatives with suspicion. In short, we must never forget the tragedies, but also the life-affirming experiences of the pandemic so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rohit. That was such a wonderful and comprehensive talk. Thanks very much. We've got one question in the Q&A, but I thought I would take advantage of my being the person who's going to comment on your talk to perhaps jump in and ask you a question, maybe a question and a half together. So I was thinking that as a historian of public health and basically having spent a career working in public health, not much of what happened in Delhi really surprised me. So a lot of what you described is what happens during the pandemic. And you speak also of a world after the pandemic, but I was thinking of a world pre-pandemic when we've already had this corruption of medically specialized hospitals, public health that hasn't had a very big element of social justice, a hugely neoliberal framework. So what is it that you feel specifically at the local level in Delhi itself, with the Aam Aadmi Party, with the disjuncture between the local and the scales of the national government? What is it specifically about Delhi and COVID then, which is different from the longer term fissures that already existed? Because of a lot of this already predates the pandemic. It was kind of like a perfect storm, in my view, that was waiting to happen. It's just a government that was much more myopic, a series of scalar kind of problems. And I thought as a geographer, you'd be ideally poised to be able to answer that. The second question kind of builds on this, if I may, which is because I really appreciate and love your work and your recent book. And I thought maybe you could tell us, when you speak of an urban kind of revanchism, we speak of the neoliberal, we hear the neoliberal in your talk, we hear about social polarization. Now, what about gentrification and the spatial element of it? And I think you mentioned that quite a bit in your book. And I thought we'd really like to hear from you, as someone who's such an eminent environmental activist as well as a scholar, to tell us a little bit more about the spatial aspect as well. So the first question really about what predates the pandemic, and the second really about gentrification and the spatial element, which really compromised this group of informal labor and those who are most vulnerable. And that's, I think, something we'd love to hear about.
Thanks so much, Kavita, for your comments. So, of course, as a historian of public health, you are so much better placed than I am to comment on the continuities and perhaps the contrast. That's not really my field. It's more that, like I said in the beginning, this is more of a way to just sort of come to terms with what's happened. Right. But since you've asked, so I think there is, if you take Asher Gertner's book from about 6 or 7 years ago, Ruled by Aesthetics, where he describes how in Delhi, this certain kind of a world-class agenda or an agenda to make or remake the city into a world-class space sort of really drives a lot of its urban policy. And we see the impacts of that in terms of, and that's connected to gentrification. So these two things really are connected to the sort of revaluing of property and to a removal of people who are considered to be not using property. Like Jesse Goldstein says, the terra economicus sort of argument, if your land is not being used to its best use economically, then, it's up for grabs. So that kind of really 2000s to me, or that decade sort of really typifies this real gentrification, property-driven revanchism. And in fact, it might be partly a response to the kinds of things, the kinds of processes that happened back then, that you had a certain kind of a shift in Delhi in the emphasis of the state in its political discourse in the 2010s. So I'm talking about now 2011, 12, and further. In part, this is because of the economic crisis back then. If you remember the housing crisis of 2008 in the US, and that spiraled into so many things elsewhere. So that crisis, plus the emergence of certain kinds of grassroots movements, they basically shifted or changed the political configuration in Delhi quite in some important ways. And in fact, they cleared the ground, or they created the ground for something like the Aam Aadmi Party to emerge, with its agenda not so much of a world-class city, but of mundane things. Its agenda not of large infrastructures, but of smaller ones. And so you have this shift that happens in Delhi in the early part of the previous decade. And when the Aam Aadmi Party, in fact, comes to power in its first term, two of its major contributions back then, we can criticize them on many accounts, but two of the major accomplishments, one was improving the elementary school system, the government school system, and the other was this neighborhood healthcare facilities, which they created across the city, these so-called mohalla clinics, neighborhood clinics. So these clinics, therefore, have been very important in terms of creating infrastructures, very local level, neighborhood level, primary infrastructures that are accessible, that are free of cost, and they are also physically accessible, being near one's homes. And there are some thousands of, some 1,200-1,300 from what I know last of these clinics. And so they had started to change the discourse and bring back the importance of sort of public infrastructures. But of course, they were completely overrun by the wave. I mean, they were still working in 2020, because I know for a fact, around my place, they were doing testing for free and there wasn't the queue. You could go anytime and get it done. But by the time this Delta wave happened, they were completely overrun. Doctors got COVID and just they were unable to cope with it. So that's as far as some of these larger shifts in which that were happening in Delhi and some of the infrastructure, but which the other point about revanchism, I mean, a little bit of it I've mentioned already in terms of property and so on. But lately, this kind of revanchism, as I signaled and you also mentioned, has to do with the politics, with the sort of overt politics, the political sort of shifts in the country. And these have very concrete manifestations. The ideas might come from wherever, from the sun, from Nagpur or wherever, but they affect everyone. They affect me in a public institution. They affect a student in JNU or DU. They affect everyone who is going to be affected by one of these, CAA, NRC, or the farmer laws and so on. And so there has been this somewhat under the radar, or sometimes also above it, I suppose, changes in and hollowing out really of institutions that I mentioned. And this also transcends to public health institutions. And in the way that ICMR and others have functioned, in the way that they've toed the government's line instead of retaining some kind of independent and critical distance from them, has been important. Just the other day, I was speaking to a scientist, and on condition of anonymity, they told me how because Omicron is coming from elsewhere, it's got news and everything, but there have been some 12 or 13 such variants already in India. But because the ICM or any body cannot share this information unless the Home Ministry allows them to do so. So there has been all this going on, and like you said, I agree completely that it's not like it was completely shocking. I mean, broad contours could have been predicted, but I think we believed, at least in Delhi, that we were somehow progressing. And I think that, therefore, has been somewhat of a shock as to whether that progress is able to cope with something like this, or it's just the scale of things is just beyond. The other thing is just finally, just because I'm sure others may also have questions, just the final thing is that because you asked with scale, I feel that a lot of times, at least in the air pollution, environmental arena, we constantly move towards regional, national, transnational scale. We tend to forget the neighborhood as a scale of importance, and air pollution discourse certainly tends to go that way. But in Delhi also there are hotspots. There are segregation, because of sort of clustering of poverty, of environmental detritus, and sometimes both of those happening together. There are these zones of special risk that need particular attention. And even Mohalla clinics, when we did our air pollution fieldwork, we realized that the doctors in these zones of risk, particular risk, their setup wasn't prepared, or it was a generic setup. It's a generic setup no matter where you are in the city. But in these sites, I think they need extra and special care for the particularities of the health.
And that's fascinating, because there seems to be, between the governance of air and the governance of bodies, there's so much in common in terms of social marginality, right? Which always kinds of comes up as being those groups get marginalized each time, whether it's the biopolitical control of bodies during the pandemic or previously. So it kind of, their risks kind of cluster together, whether it's environmental exposures or health exposures, they kind of come together. But thank you for that. Maybe we'll just move quickly, Rohit, if it's okay, to one of the questions. The question is, I wanted to ask if you could expand more on the differences in the AAP's response versus the central government, and particularly the possibilities and limitations of the AAP's response in terms of oxygen shortages, collaborations with civil society. So is there a gap there in the AAP's response? And perhaps, again, coming back to that question of scale, what happened at the local Delhi government level that was insufficient, I think is the question.
Yeah. So I think I did talk a little bit about this, that how the AAP tried to, first of all, AAP is, two things I would say about them is that they are more open to civil society, working with civil society and speaking with civil society than the central government, that's for sure. In fact, the central government has just shut down or forced to shut down so many organizations, from Amnesty to Greenpeace and now Oxfam, because of, through certain licensing and so on measures. That's one. The other is that by and large, at least until 2021, one could see that the AAP was trying to also let the expertise sort of drive some of its responses, and they were fine with taking the back seat a little bit in terms of whether taking the credit or blame, whatever that may be, for what they did. And in those two ways, I think they were a little bit different. In one, the foregrounding of public health expertise, and B, in terms of their openness or willingness to collaborate with civil society. Of course, in Delhi, the situation is so complicated that I also mentioned, because you can just the other day, in fact, Delhi government wanted to open markets which had been closed because of the Omicron spread, as the positivity rate is going down and there's all kinds of employment and livelihood concerns. So they actually wanted to open the markets, but the lieutenant governor sent the file back, refused to allow them to open. So there are all these constraints that they're working with. And of course, they also now have become much more politically savvy and sort of pragmatic in a sense. And so this is a different AAP, I feel, in the last year, in the last 6 months or so. It's very much an AAP that now is primarily attuned to electoral dynamics rather than larger social contract that it had come out of. So there is a difference between those two things.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just stop there, I suppose.
Right, thanks. I think we have a few more minutes. Let me check. There's a few more questions. A major theme of your talk was the importance of situating public health concern in a wider landscape of social and geopolitical dynamics. Public health isn't simply a medical matter. Sometimes medical concerns trade off against or are opportunistically mobilized. I wonder if you could speak to any general lessons we can learn from the case of Delhi about how to handle, negotiate, or navigate these tensions. I think these tensions of how public health is often not simply a medical matter, but it's mobilized politically.
Yeah, and again, I'll come here with the air pollution example, but that's not only because that's an aspect I know better. So in air pollution, as you might know, there's this supposedly the environmental health pathway from studying the concentration of pollutants in the ambient air, then to studying the exposure and then the dose effects and then the health impacts of those pollutants. But that pathway actually has bifurcated into two different areas of research and science and intervention. So the first is what is known as monitoring sciences. So you have chemists and atmospheric scientists and environmental scientists, whether using models or sophisticated gadgets and so on, and publishing papers about the constituents of air pollution. 9 out of 10 papers that are published on air pollution are by these people. Their turnover time is really fast. You can start a project now, and in 6 months you can have a paper published. You never even have to visit Delhi to publish a paper on air pollution if you are working in this landscape. On the other hand, the second one, with the public health one, is slow research. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources, and it might take anything from 10 years to 15 years to be able to say anything meaningful about health impacts. And it just seems like there is no time for that. In the kind of debate that we have, and COVID can be sort of classified or included in this, that there is this urgency and there is a call for the time is somehow compressed. You have to act in compressed time. But I think we need to slow down a little bit and bring public health more to the or foreground it far more than it has been. I mean, I'm sure that you know about that. You have many opinions on this, but I'm saying it more from the air pollution dynamic, where it's as if the more we know, or all we need is knowledge, and then everything will be sorted out. All we need is to know air pollution will be sorted out. I think here too we need to. I think there is a case to be made, even though it's a very urgent situation in many ways, for slowing down and more ethical and responsible. Like Max Liboron, STS scholar up in Canada, talks about this sort of slow advocacy as we don't need to always go or think about super efficient or effective measures. We just need to think about steps that are just good, and I think some of that thinking might be valuable here too.
I think translation is always an issue. Translation of environmental sciences into a public discourse, into a kind of citizens-led discourse, and similarly with public health, because there is a tendency constantly to look for these magic bullets. That's true with our vaccines, and it's true with just wanting some kind of pill to get everything. So the curative aspect is clearly always much more of a lure, and that's what governments prefer, that's what pharma companies prefer. It's all part of a kind of biocapitalism, which is preferred to investing in public health, which is, I think, it's far more invisible. The returns of it when someone does not fall sick is much harder to compute, which you have metrics for that. But it's a much more tricky thing. But translation, both for, I think that's in common when we talk about experts between environment and public health, becomes a big barrier, I think. And that takes me, actually, the vaccine point takes me to Arden's question, where Arden's asking about, you showed the vaccine certificate with Modi's, Prime Minister Modi's face also there and everything else. So are vaccines a kind of political ideology? Is their uptake influenced by politics? Arden wanted to hear a little bit more about how do they become a vehicle really to transmit or transport a political ideology.
Absolutely, they have been made into a vehicle. So in very brief, what happens is that when the Delta wave hits us, suddenly people ask as to why is it that such a small number of people are actually vaccinated, even though vaccinations began in January. Mm-hmm. And it was for various reasons. Partly it was that, we basically believe that, or the government basically believed that COVID was done in India. We didn't need to, worry about it too much. They said that in so many words, and they lagged behind in terms of vaccination. And when the dust settled on Delta, or as it was settling, I think they regrouped the coterie, the political coterie that runs the country, the sort of oligarchy. They regrouped, and they were like, okay, this Delta wave has really hurt us really bad. And in fact, even in surveys, the popularity of the Prime Minister had gone down by several percentage after this wave. And so I think in that regrouping, they believed that the immediate thing that they could do was to just focus on vaccination. Because that is something you can scale up faster than perhaps larger infrastructures and all the other kinds of interventions that were needed. And so they did so. They said, okay, now by the end of December 2021, we'll have 100% vaccination. That hasn't happened, but that was enough in terms of announcements. Then the other thing that's happened, and why you have the image of the PM on the certificates, is that this personality cult has been watered and been built over the last few years. And so it's as if every government initiative, measure, transfer to the society, it's as if it comes directly or straight from the Prime Minister. So that has to be shown. This sort of direct connect between the leader and the masses is always sort of foregrounded, always created, constructed. And so we have this. And so every landmark in vaccination is celebrated. Most of the Indian media is basically like Russia, essentially party owned. And so they would, champion and really celebrate every single landmark. So from, 100 million, 200 million, every 100 million, there'll be a whole, hours will be spent celebrating it and, hailing the leader.
Right.
And thanking the leader for all of this. So that's basically how they sort of use vaccination then.
Right. Thanks, Rohit. That was a great talk. We have a minute more, so I want to have a kind of soundbite from you. What we've described is an awful kind of dystopic nightmare when we think about what's happened, especially with the with the trauma that we've experienced in Delhi with the Delta wave. So if we had to think, revanchism is also about portraying a kind of utopia, right? A utopia that is the utopia of a select group of citizens. So what is, when you think about the future after this pandemic, whose futures do you think the government and society are going to engage with when we think of a post-pandemic future? There is various kinds of utopias that are, for citizens. And especially since you're interested in informal workers and their economies, what is the problem? Why are they in these multiple visions? How does something, what do you think gets selected? What are the lessons we're going to learn out of this pandemic? Will it, in the selection of a better world?
I think there are a few. One, I think it has shown to a lot of us that this regime and this sort of that has been erected, or at least an image of infallibility that has been constructed is actually not so. That it is fallible, that it can be countered, it can be critiqued. It also exposes what many of us is known as very clearly as complete incompetency when it comes to details, when it comes to carrying things out. And the difference between announcements and publicity events and actually changing institutional, carrying the things out. These things have become very clear, I think. It's easier to make those arguments now with a wide range of people than it was before the pandemic. So to that extent, it creates an opening, a political opening. And certainly in the next few months, as the largest state in India goes to elections, it is an open election, far more open than I believe it would have been had it not been for the past few months. The other is, I believe that the farmers movement and the CAA movement also have shown the way that you cannot just, that you have to keep at it. Basically, that's what they've shown, that you have to keep at it no matter what sort of negative publicity or propaganda that is thrown at you. And there is incredible courage that so many people have shown. There are political opponents who are in prison, who have been imprisoned in the last few years, and who continue to ask and fight. And I think the movements, and then have really shown us that we can change things really. Even though, and my colleague Rachna is also here, that we are usually quite a depressed bunch. But now that you think about these things and I'm talking, it seems to be slightly.
Yeah, I think you've painted something which out of this out of everything that we've discussed, there are threads of a certain hope and a social hope and possibility, which I think we still have to see how it will get mobilized. But on that note, I want to thank you vigorously for a wonderful talk. I think it's left us all with a range of questions which we'd not posed in our understanding of the pandemic in Delhi, but also a range of other questions. So on behalf of Rishi, Sarah, and everyone else, I'd like to warmly thank you. And we look forward to staying in touch. And thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thanks so much to you, to Rishi, Sarah, and all the supporters and organizers. And thanks to the participants for tuning in.